Just like psychologists, there are many ways that sociologists can conduct research and gain information about the world around them. Although some of the methods that sociologists use are the same as psychologists, there are several that are different. Remember that sociology is a social science. In other words, we are trying to study society and its behavior scientifically, which is no easy task. The first aspect of research methods that must be gone over is the limitations of trying to study human behavior scientifically. Problem number 1. Human behavior is too difficult to predict. We oftentimes think that people will have a certain reaction to something, however, they don't. How many times have you walked away from a conversation saying, "That's not how I thought that would go"? If you are having trouble recalling one of those times, watch this. Now, did you really think that was going to happen? Problem number 2. Humans oftentimes respond to their surroundings, so noticing a researcher will change the behavior of the subject. This is known as the Hawthorne effect. I am sure you have been in class where a teacher is being observed by a principal. Take away the obvious bribing by the teacher that he or she offers so the students will behave. A lot of times the students will still act differently when they know they are being watched. Ever feel like someone is watching you at the mall? Your behavior usually changes, whether it's leaving, trying to be more discreet, or even making a bigger jerk out of yourself. Problem number 3. Social patterns change. What is true for one place and time is not true for another. Women of the 1800s are not the same women that exist now. This happens even across cultures as well. Japanese women are not the same as American women. Their behaviors are much different. Problem number 4. Researchers have a hard time being value-free. Sociologists try to remain unbiased. However, it is human nature to have an opinion and want a study to prove that you are right. Before we can get into the various methods that sociologists use to conduct research, a distinction must be made between qualitative data and quantitative data. Qualitative data deals with descriptions. It is data that can be observed but is very difficult to measure. Quantitative data, on the other hand, deals with numbers. This is data that can be measured. In class, your quantitative data activity dealt with looking at different percentages of different variables in various cities across the United States. Everything that you looked at dealt with numbers, and then you drew conclusions based on those numbers. In other words, you analyzed the data. So let's go through the methods. There are 4 main methods that sociologists use to conduct research. The first method is experimentation. Experimentation is a method used for cause and effect patterns in a controlled environment. For example, you punch your brother in the arm to see if he will punch you back. Experimentation requires a hypothesis or an educated guess about what the results will be. You will also have an independent and dependent variable. Your independent variable is the variable that is altered, while the dependent variable is what happens because of it. Experimenters also need a control group and an experimental group. Your experimental group receives the treatment or the altered behavior, while the control group receives nothing. Some experiments that we have already discussed include the Stanford Prison Experiment, the Milgram Experiment, and the Marshmallow Test. There are many advantages and disadvantages for using this method. It is the best way to see the cause and effect relationship. If this happens, then that will happen. It is also very easy to replicate. Think about it. How many science experiments have you done throughout your high school career? With advantages, there are also disadvantages. The biggest problem when using this method is that the results may be biased. This can happen if your experiment is not carefully controlled. The second method used by sociologists is the survey method. This method requires subjects to respond to questions or an interview. When creating a survey, it would be pointless to administer the survey to subjects that have no stake in it. For example, why would men care about the latest Coach purse? Although they may care about it if it's a satchel. Therefore, we need to narrow down our population or our universe. Our population is simply the subject. single moms, teenagers, Catholics, Hispanic Americans, whatever the subject may be. We then draw a random sample from our population since it would be impossible to administer the survey to all our subjects. This was done with the M&Ms in the sampling activity in psychology. The advantages of using the survey method include being able to gain a large sample and/or getting in-depth responses. Disadvantages include wording questions carefully and the time and expense it takes when dealing with someone. Please review the types of questions that you can put in a survey. The next method that can be used when studying society is field observations. This is also called naturalistic observations and deals with observing people in their natural environment. This method really focuses on qualitative data rather than quantitative data. The advantages of using this method is that it is very inexpensive, as you are just observing the behavior. It also allows the researcher to study natural behavior. In other words, how we think people will act in their own setting when they think no one is paying attention.
It's not unusual to be lonely. It's not unusual to have fun with anyone. But when I see you hanging about with anyone, it's not unusual to see me cry. I wanna die. It's not unusual to go out at any time. But when I see you out and about, it's such a crime. If you should ever want to be loved by anyone, it's not unusual, it happens every.
There are limits to using this method as well. First, it is very time-consuming, especially if the researcher is waiting for a specific behavior to occur. It is also difficult to replicate. After all, the same people are not at the same location every day, with the exception of work. Lastly, it is extremely difficult to balance the role of the participant and the researcher. If the researcher focuses on the role of the participant too much, they may miss important observations. However, if they focus on the role of the researcher too much, well, then they just look like a creeper, and the Hawthorne effect can come into play. The last method that sociologists use is secondary analysis. This is looking at data collected by others. When you complete reports and projects in school, you are using secondary analysis. You are researching things that are not your own. The advantages to using this method is that it saves research time and money since the data is already collected. It also allows historical research to happen. For example, we can trace divorce rates throughout U.S. history or how many children people had. The possibilities are endless. There are also limitations to this method. For example, the data may not be suitable for what the researcher needs. If the researcher is analyzing divorce patterns in the United States, and data was not collected for African Americans during the early 1900s, then they are missing an important piece of information for their study. A researcher also has no control over the possible bias of the previous researcher or data. If the information is not accurate or skewed, the current researcher cannot go back and change that information. Therefore, it may be null and void. Once data is collected, the researcher can draw certain conclusions over the data, including the relationship that the variables may have to one another. One of the relationships that variables may have is a direct relationship or a positive relationship. This is where both variables increase in value. In the summertime, the sale of ice cream increases dramatically. Cases of rape also increase in the summertime. It is important to note that although variables may increase or decrease in values, It does not mean that one causes the other. It simply looks at the relationship that they have. It would be silly to assume that ice cream causes rape, even though both variables increase. The next relationship that variables can have is an indirect relationship. This is where one variable increases and another variable decreases. So in other words, they have a negative relationship. An example of a negative relationship would be the more time that I spend at the mall, the increased variable, the less money that I have in my checking account, the decreased variable. The last relationship that variables can have is a null relationship. A null relationship simply means that there is no relationship between the variables. Sometimes they both increase, sometimes one goes up and one goes down, but there's no definitive relationship that can be established. The last set of vocabulary that has to be gone over is mean, median, and mode. These three terms are oftentimes used in mathematics and statistics. The mean is the average of your numbers that you have collected. Median means that it occurs in the middle of the series, and mode is the number that occurs most often. We will use an example of these three concepts in class by using your ages. If you have any questions about any of the research methods that have been gone over, please see me either before or after class.